Welcome everyone to the Maul Study Circle, our second online streaming event. So if there's a couple of technical hiccups, we'll work it out. First things first, let's make the legal department happy. Any views expressed here are solely those of the presenter. That is a technical difficulty right there. Are solely those of the presenter, and they are not of any grand or local Masonic body. My name is Jason. I'm the chairman here at the Setting Maul, and I'll be your presenter this evening. We're going to talk about Masonic media myths and how we're viewed in the media. And we're going to divide it into three categories: the good, the bad, and the benign. Over here on the left, we have, for those of you that may be a little veteran in the craft, we have the dispatcher from Hill Street Blues. Philip Freemason Esterhaus was his name. He was the guy that went, hey guys, let's be careful out there. A little trip down memory lane. He's, obviously the good, law enforcement folks that pillars of the community and also happen to be Masons. Speaking of pillars of the community, we have the benign in the middle, which is Taco Bell's newest ad campaign, the Illuminati, which has made all sorts of fun friend requests on Facebook for any of us who have a square and compasses in our profile picture. And we have at the end the bad, which is Freemasons as these secret supervillains, and that is a panel from Hell by Alan Moore, who we'll get into a little bit later. But we're going to start off this evening with the good. This is where Masons are in a positive or heroic light. Not so many of these because it's kind of hackneyed to have like a Masonic superhero. And the only time you really see that is in media produced by the craft. And for all kinds of reasons, Masons don't produce a lot of movies, the Freemason movies notwithstanding. But we have a lot of background characters. Like we have Sergeant Apone from one of my favorite movies of all time, Aliens. He is the gruff but kind-hearted colonial marine from Aliens who goes down swinging to save his men. You can see he has a Masonic ring on his hand as he busts Bill Paxton down a peg. You see it even earlier. You see Andy Griffith. He actually was in the Andy Griffith program. He was not a member of the Masons. He's a member of the Regal Order of the Golden Door to Good Fellowship. Was the name of the fraternal organization in Mayberry. There was actually an episode called The Lodge in which one of his friends is blackballed, and it revolved around that. But there is a Masonic connection where when he goes out to Hollywood to show the screen system that he wrote in the screen print, he talks about visiting his cousin who is a Grand Master out in California. And we can't have Masons as the good guys without, National Treasure. In the very rare sense that you haven't seen this movie, go out and Redbox it. But it's the basic crux of the story is Nicolas Cage's father tells him that Freemasons hid secret Templar gold in Washington, D.C. And if you look at the back of the Declaration of Independence, there's a map to that treasure. It's a real fun, family-friendly movie, but it does show Masons, that trope of Masons as the soul signers of the Constitution, and that Americans, and especially American Masons, love to embrace. We see here one of the props from the film, a pipe that has a Royal Arch, a Templar, and a Blue Lodge symbol on it. And on the right is that secret square and compasses that Ben Franklin put on the back of the Declaration of Independence for people to find the treasure. To speak on the good, like I said before, we don't see a lot of it aside from these characters, these background characters that people placed in there. And we also see most of it in like Andy Griffith in the 60s, like the 50s, like everybody from Mr. Cunningham from Happy Days was an elk, to even Archie Bunker was a member of a fictional fraternal society. These are characters that I think they're shown in the best light, this good light, because they reflect either the creators and authors of these programs were from that greatest generation, joiners generation that came back to embrace these fraternal organizations, or it's a throwback, like a sense of happy days, to a happier time where these organizations were what you did on a Friday night. There's even an anecdote in MASH, which by no means was a happy program, but it was Hawkeye talks about how his mother is dating a third-degree Mason, and she brings him down to the lodge on Fridays for bingo. So there's certainly an amount of nostalgia in these good views of the craft. Probably the most common use of Masonry in the media, though, is the benign. Like, we're not the bad guys, but we're spooky. Where square and compasses or the American Great Seal is shorthand for, dastardly taco-selling, controlling the world kind of organizations. We see it in True Grit. This is true of both the 2010 remake and the original John Wayne film, that the daughter in the film says, "You bury Papa in his Masonic apron," and you see in his effects he has some coffee, a 6-gun, and a square and compasses pendant, which is all you really need in the Wild West. We see in Tombstone, Creek Johnson, who was in real life was also one of the Wyatt Earp's associates, but we don't know if he was a Mason or not, has a square and compasses pendant around his neck. And you see a lot of this stuff, especially in Civil War movies, movies in this period. And Glory, they all have, several of the actors have square and compasses tied onto their shoulders. You see it in Gettysburg. They have several people with square and compasses pendants, which kind of it shows the general American public has that knowledge of Masonry being a big deal in this brother versus brother kind of warfare, where perhaps some folks in the craft might know are the Masonic connections to World War II or the Revolutionary War, but it's very much in the public consciousness. And the Civil War and the Western expansion after that was a Masonic conflict. We also see it like in Big Fish, which is a movie set in the 30s, in which the main character is given the keys to the city in this small southern town. And to tie in with that time period, it'd be very appropriate for the Shrine Parade to show up to celebrate the main character getting the keys to the town. So it's a lot of these benign experiences are just historical window dressing. They don't really mean anything. They're not meant to symbolize anything except to show historically where we're at. That aside, this is somewhere between a little bit benign, a little bit bad, a little bit good. Dan Brown, he wrote the book in 2009, The Lost Symbol, which mirrors in many ways every other book that he's written. But the quick synopsis is a 33rd degree Mason is murdered in Washington, D.C., and the Robert Langdon, the main character, has to run around D.C. looking at the architecture of the city to stop a ticking time bomb and reveal the secrets of the Freemasons. It's a very interesting novel. I would recommend it if you're into the Dan Brown mystery kind of sense, but it basically, at the end of the book, spoilers for a 9-year-old book, paints the Masons as Gnostics, and we're hiding the secret knowledge of Gnosticism in the architecture of Washington, D.C., which I guess doesn't make us necessarily evil, but that is kind of a mean thing to hide from everybody, the secret to apotheosis. One of my favorites, another program that I watched growing up, you can probably guess between the PowerPoint and the references that there's a millennial behind the controls today, is Joe Rogan, someone known for some very interesting theories about the Masons in his real life. But there's a program in news radio in which the radio station runs into some financial trouble, and they say to flash the sign that Joe Rogan's character is making right here to have the judge dismiss the charges. He does in the television program, but later appears with a giant paddle with a M written on it to kind of satire the view of Masons as the old boys club, or whatever you may personally do with a giant paddle. The most recent probably is the Bell Illuminati. Taco Bell has they've gotten cameras into our lodges, and any Mason out there knows that this is pretty cut and dry for a Masonic meeting. But it's the ad campaign runs around basically these secret society that has access to their $1 menu at Taco Bell. Comments on the quality of Taco Bell aside, it is an interesting. Please don't sue me, Taco Bell. It is an interesting campaign. It's very well promoted. It actually had a 30-second run on the Super Bowl, and it seems to be gaining traction because there are many supposed Masonic bots on Facebook who will pester you about the Illuminati if you indicate you're a Mason on a Facebook profile. Another one of my favorites is if anybody's familiar with the Red Green Show. If they can't find you handsome, they might as well find you handy. Red Green was part of a secret backwoods fraternal organization of the International Possum Brotherhood. And the Latin around there reads, when in doubt, play dead. Which is always good advice to have. And another recent one, Gravity Falls, which I believe is ongoing. If any of you out there have young children, you've probably seen this. The general crux of this program is two kids go to stay with their elder family member here on the left, Stan, who is wearing a Shriner's fez, and he runs a secret mystery spot, which it kind of converges like all sorts of weird conspiracy theories. There's the government's involved, there's UFOs, and this character on the right called Bill Cipher, who in no way looks Masonic to me, but he is the main antagonist for the program, and is kind of like an extra-dimensional demon who kind of antagonizes the main characters. And before we get into the bad, I think we can see that in the same way that the 60s and the 50s show a good view of the craft, we have millennials or even Generation Z have this kind of benign, too cool for school, kind of skeptical view of the Masons. We either view them as a old boys club or kind of something farcical, which kind of marks the membership trends that some Grand Lodges might be seeing. And we're going to get into the bad, which in many ways mirrors Generation X and the lost generation for Masonic purposes that we see that didn't join, and the material and media they produced. In the same way that we have good guys in aliens and tombstone wearing Masonic rings, we also have bad guys. The main antagonist from Fargo here wearing a Masonic ring. We also have The Man Who Would Be King, another strong Masonic film, which is strange in all manners of terms. That is based on a book by Kipling, and he is actually a character in the movie. We see here his watch fob on the right, which Sean Connery steals from him at the beginning of the movie. So these are mercenaries and roguish characters and pickpockets. They're not really Masons. But a thumbnail sketch of the film is Connery and Michael Caine. Their characters go off to Afghanistan and get involved in a private mercenary war. Connery is shot with an arrow, which is stopped by a bandolier, and when they bring him before the high priest to see if he's a man or a god, they tear off his clothing to find the Masonic pendant, which they believe is a sign of godhood from Alexander the Great. Long story short, it's a very interesting film, but it doesn't really end very well for the two main shucksters of the characters. But it definitely portrays them in maybe a little bit of a predatory aspect with these native peoples. We have Britain in general we'll speak on later, but the Brits, and especially the certain aspects of the British media, have a very skewed view of Freemasonry. For those of you watching across the pond, or those of you with a PBS habit, Inspector George Gently is a detective serial produced in Britain. In this particular one, it's called a common believing, and it revolves around a prominent Mason is murdered. So in order to find the murderer, the inspector joins his father-in-law's lodge to kind of root out the nefarious actors. And it's the strange, convoluted view of the old boys club. In fact, one of the quotes from the show is, this is all done to influence the elections. All Masons are Tories. So it's kind of a real strict misunderstanding of what we do, but also fairly par for the course of a certain British view of Masonry, which is probably most commonly seen in the works of Alan Moore and one of his most skewed views of Masonry, From Hell. This is a comic that was serialized from 1989 to 1998 and collected in full in 1999. And I will say Alan Moore, From Hell, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, Watchmen, for those of you that comic book nerds out there, he is a fine author, but he is a little skewed his conspiracy theories, and he might be a crazy space wizard, which we'll see in a second. But From Hell, basically the basic plot is Prince Albert has a bastard son, and Queen Victoria enlists the Masons to go and kill the mother and secure the royal bloodline. Unfortunately, not all goes as planned, and the murderer here, the doctor, goes a little bit crazy and starts murdering local sex workers in a view that he's going to commit this great Masonic ritual in which he will secure man's dominance over women for the next 100 years. And it ends on perhaps not the best note, in which he is captured, receives a Masonic trial, is found insane and hidden away, and the Masons frame a third party as Jack the Ripper, instead of letting their brother Mason come to justice. We see this again in League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, which is basically a collection of all the Victorian pulp heroes, Tom Sawyer, Alan Quatermain, Dracula's Bride, The Invisible Man, and they basically form this Avengers group to go and fight Dr. Moriarty. And towards the end, we see Moriarty's secret SWAT goon squad have noticeable square compasses on their arms, and they're tied to the British crown. This is Alan Moore. You can see perhaps why I think he might be a secret space wizard. But he is, no offense to Alan Moore, all jokes aside, he is very much a product of that late 80s, early 90s British view of Masonry. And by no means is this entirely a British thing. French newspapers, to this day, the tabloids will have one or two anti-Masonic cover stories a year as kind of a way to bump sales. Because of a complicated view of Masonry in Europe, there is a market for this anti-Masonic material. And while in America, traditionally there are certain religious sects that take issue with Freemasonry, it's very strong tradition of political anti-Masonry over there. The reason we don't have it here, most likely, is because when we tie characters such as George Washington to the craft, it's kind of difficult to stand on your two political feet and criticize George Washington. But the modern anti-Masonic movement in Britain started in 1989 with the publishing of the Inside the Brotherhood, the Further Secrets of Freemasons, written by a tabloid journalist, and it basically outlines how Masons are a secret old boys network in the police and the judiciary, covering up murders and pedophilia and all sorts of un-Masonic business. It had no proof attached to it, but it sold thousands of copies and took root in the minds of British politicians and the British public. To this day, the Welsh Assembly, which is the Congress of Wales, requires a declaration of membership in closed groups, which only seems to be enforced against Masons. It says, you know, the Cardiff and Country Club, the Rotary, but in reality it was made to focus on Freemasons. Judicial candidates needed to declare their Masonic status until the year 2009, first-time judicial candidates in Great Britain, until that was slapped down by the European courts. And it's still asked that police officers and judiciary voluntarily state whether or not they're in a closed group, which means Masonry. So in the same way that the Millennials and Generation Z have a skeptical view or a farcical view of Freemasonry, and the greatest generation, the baby boomers, have a more reverent view, it's that Generation X in the middle has, like all things, either a skeptical or antagonistical view. So we can see that all these different groups, all these different eras, they affect the media, which affects the public perception of the craft. And speaking on public perceptions of the craft, our next meeting will be on June 4th. We're going to have symbologist Michelle Snyder stream in. She's going to be speaking on symbols of leadership and power. She's the renowned author of several books. One of the more recent ones is Symbology Revisions, which you see here. She'll also be speaking at the Grand Lodge of New Jersey on June 6th, so we're sneaking in right before that, and she'll be speaking on the origins of myths and legends. So if any of you are in the New Jersey area,